Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 12, the central nervous system. One thing I'm going to say about this chapter is it's going to be a combo of lecture chapter, combo of, hey, memorize this. So while it won't be a total memorized chapter like chapter 10 was for the muscles, that you'll have a combo of both of this, so just as a heads up. So the first thing we'll talk about is central nervous system. We did talk a little bit about it in the last chapter, but the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord, which we've talked about. One thing that's important with regards to our central nervous system is something called cephalization. And so evolutionary development of the rostral or the anterior portion of the CNS is just amazing. It's important and essential. Evolutionary development resulted in sort of this increased number of neurons. And so basically that's the highest level reached is in the human brain. So with the development of cephalization and the increased number of neurons and all of these things, we have reached that highest level of function, at least so far, in the human. And so you can see the embryonic development of the human brain, of course, when we look at it in the process. This is a neural tube. I mentioned that at the end of the last chapter. Of course, there's this anterior, a rostral, and then the posterior, which is the caudal. And then, of course, the brain primary vesicles then start to form. So you start seeing this broadening of this neural tube to where you get this a forebrain being formed, this sort of midsection, and the hindbrain that's starting to develop. But then, of course, we start developing these little secondary brain vesicles, so you can start seeing some pinching off, the creation of what's going to be the diencephalon, the teleocephalon here. That's going to eventually lead to things like the cerebrum, the cerebral hemisphere, cortex, white matter, basal nuclei, all of those things. Of course, the diencephalon, that's the thalamus, the hypothalamus, retinas, things like that. The mesocephalon, of course, that's the brainstem and midbrain. So you can start to see this development about what each section is going to result for this adult brain structure. They do eventually create these adult neural regions. And so basically the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle is that diencephalon, the cerebral aqueduct, which is the brainstem, the fourth ventricle, which encounters these. So you can see that development over time and how that processes in embryological development and how that relates to the development of the full human brain. And of course, within that development, there are two major fixtures that form, causing telecephalization in the diencephalon, basically to angle towards the brainstem. This, of course, will be the spinal cord. You can kind of see the myelencephalon, the tencephalon here, the diencephalon here. So you can see that brain development in those regions in embryological development. And of course, here's that functioning or as starting to develop that cerebral hemisphere, the outline of the diencephalon, that midbrain, cerebellum, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and of course that spinal cord. This is by week 13. So an adult brain basically has four regions. We have the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and the cerebellum. And so you can kind of see, here's that full brain. But you can see where those structures are from that colored image from week 13 to how it ends up becoming developed in that adult. So where that pattern shows up in the adult system. And so there are some brain regions that are important to mention. Gray matter, those are short, non-myelinated neurons and cell bodies. And white matter, which is myelinated and non-myelinating axons. So the basic pattern found in the CNS, that central cavity surrounded by gray matter with white matter external to gray matter. The fixtures and changes of pattern, the spinal cord exhibits this basic pattern. However, pattern changes with ascent into the brain stem. So this is sort of that distribution of gray and white matter that you can kind of see in that central nervous system. You can kind of see here this inner gray matter that's in that central body. Gray matter is the neuron cell bodies, the short non-myelinated neurons, while the white matter consists mostly of those myelinated axons. So the brain region, of course, continued on. The brainstem has additional gray matter, nuclei scattered within white matter. And of course, the cerebral hemispheres, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So they contain an outer layer of gray matter called the cortex. So the cerebrum and the cerebellum also have scattered areas of gray matter nuclei amid that white matter that's there. And so here's some of the images of the ventricles of the brain. You can kind of see you have things like the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, lateral ventricle, anterior horn is here. So make sure that you can memorize the ventricles of the brain and their importance in that layout. Again, another thing that's important to learn is the lobes and the fissures of that cerebral hemisphere. So here, of course, is that longitudinal fissure, and of course in the superior view. In addition, there's the left lateral view. You can see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, that transverse cerebral fissure, the brain stem, and things like that. Making sure that you're understanding and memorizing each one of those. So there is several things that will divide, or the sulci that will divide the hemisphere to 5 lobes. The frontal, the parietal, the temporal, occipital, and insula. So the first 4 are named after overlying skull bones. The insular lobe is buried under portions of the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. So make sure you do look at the animation of the brain when you, again, it won't play for me on here for some reason, but it will on your PowerPoints, and that's loaded. So again, these are the lobes colored for you, so you can see the different hemispheres and lobes of the different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. Frontal lobe being here, so making sure that you understand each of these, the parietal lobe here, and the sulci and the fissures that are associated with that. And of course, this is just one in which there is a instrument peeling back, a scapula that's peeling back that frontal lobe and the temporal lobe being pulled away and down so that you can see that that insula that's located underneath so that you understand where that is. And of course, making sure that you memorize and understand the functional and structural areas of the cerebral cortex and each one of these images in this lateral view. Talking about the central nervous system on the cerebral white matter, the second of the 3 basic regions of the cerebral hemispheres. Basically, they're responsible for communication between the cerebral areas and between the cortex and the lower central nervous system. They consist of myelinated fibers bundled into large tracts, and they, of course, are classified according to the direction they run, association, commissarial, and projection fibers. The association fibers of that cerebral white matter, they have a horizontal running fibers that connects different parts of the same hemisphere. The commissarial fibers, they are horizontal fibers that connect gray matter to 2 hemispheres, And then the projection fibers are vertical fibers that connect hemispheres with the lower brain or spinal cord. The internal capsule projection fibers on each side of the brainstem form this compact band, and it passes through the thalamus and some of the basic nuclei. I jumped ahead. The corona radiata is basically projection fibers that radiate through the cerebral white matter. So, of course, this is that white fiber tracts of those cerebral hemispheres. So making sure you understand those tracts and their association with each of the parts of the brain as well. And of course, this is the parasagittal section and dissection of those white fiber tracts again, seeing that from a different angle. And then, of course, the basal nuclei. So you can see basically the caudate nucleus and, of course, that putamen structure there. And the thalamus is associated. So the basal nuclei is also important. Again, this is just another animation to view a rotatable brain that's been sectioned. So make sure to view that. And then, of course, making sure to understand each of the structures of that diencephalon. So this is the main thalamic nuclei, making sure that you're understanding the ventral, anterior, lateral, and posterior lateral, and understanding each of those functions of that diencephalon. Locations, I should say, not functions. So the hypothalamus is located below the thalamus. It forms a cap over the brainstem and forms this inferior lateral walls of the third ventricle. Basically contains many important nuclei such as the mammillary bodies. Those are paired anterior nuclei that act as olfactory relay stations. So the infundibulum, basically that's the stalk that connects to the pituitary gland. So do make sure that you understand the selected structures of the diencephalon and know where they're located. The hypothalamus is the main visceral control and regulating center that is vital to our homeostasis. It's the chief homeostasis controls. It controls the autonomic nervous system, things like blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, digestive tract motility, pupil size, etc. It also initiates physical responses to emotions. It's part of the limbic system and sort of perceives pleasure, fear, rage, biological rhythms, and other drives like sex drives and things like that. The hypothalamus, it also is involved, as we said, since it's partly or big part of regulating homeostasis. It's going to regulate body temperature, sweating, shivering, hunger, satiety, water balance and thirst, sleep-wake cycles, things like that. It does control the endocrine system functions, so the secretions of the anterior pituitary gland and the production of the posterior pituitary hormones. We've seen this before, but making sure you're, again, reviewing that mid-sagittal section of the brain and where things are located and memorizing those as we talk down the list of things here. Of course, this is the mid-sagittal section, a cadaver version. So this is sort of the three views of the brainstem and the diencephalon. The brainstem is green, the diencephalon is purple, and each of its different aspects, so make sure you know each one of those. The medulla oblongata is the respiratory center. It basically generates respiratory rhythm and controls rate and depth of breathing. It works coordinating with the pontine centers as well. But there are all those other things it regulates: vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing. And then there's the cerebellum. 11% of the brain mass makes up basically is the cerebellum. It's located dorsal to the pons and the medulla. It processes input from the cortex, the brainstem, the sensory receptors to provide this precise coordinated movements of the skeletal muscles, and it plays a major role in balance. The cerebral anatomy, of course, there's the cerebral hemispheres that are connected to the vermis, which is a very worm-like structure. The fola, which is transversely originated gyri. Each hemisphere has three lobes: the anterior, posterior, and the foconodular, and of course it contains a thin cortex of gray matter with distinctive tree-like pattern of white matter called the arbor vitae. So this is, of course, the anatomy of the cerebellum. Make sure you understand that as well. Continuing on through the central nervous system, kind of towards this last part of chapter 12, is kind of talking about the functional brain systems and learning the functional brain system. So the network of neurons that work together but span wide areas of the brain, the limbic system, and the reticular formation. So this, of course, is an image showing you the limbic system, making sure that you look through each one of those and what parts of the brain is connected to that. So some of the functions of these brain regions, of course, the cerebral hemispheres, you can see the page numbers located. They have basically localizes and interprets sensory inputs, controls voluntary motor skills, things like that. The basal ganglia, or basal nuclei, or the ganglia, are motor centers and help skeletal movements. The thymus relays sensory impulses. You can see where that is. The hypothalamus, chief integration center of autonomic or involuntary nervous system, regulates body temperatures, food, etc., homeostasis, water balance, all of that. And then the limbic system, of course, includes the cerebral and diencephalon structures, the hypothalamus, the anterior thalamic nuclei, and it mediates that emotional response. And then, of course, the brain stem, lots of things that's happening. The midbrain, of course, really contains that visual reflex centers, the nuclei for the cranial nerves 3 and 4. The pons relays information to the cerebrum and cerebellum and associated things. The medulla oblongata, lots of different things that it has, but it basically can control heart rate, blood vessel diameter, respiratory rate, etc., coughing, all of those things. And the reticular formation maintains that cerebral the cortical alertness, and it filters out any of the repetitive stimuli that may be faced. The cerebrum, or the cerebellum, basically processes information from cerebral motor cortex and provides sort of instructions to the cerebral motor cortex and cortical motor centers, so you have a smooth, coordinated skeletal muscle movements. We do see some higher mental functions in the human brain, such as language, memory, brain waves, EEGs, consciousness, sleep and wake cycles. I won't talk all about all of these, so make sure that you go through your text to see some of those, but I will mention a few. Language is one, and language is just an implementation system. It involves the cortex of the left hemisphere. The main areas are the Broca's area, which is involved in speech production. People that have lesions in Broca's can understand the words but may not be able to speak them. And then Wernicke's area, which is involved in understanding spoken and written words. If you have a lesion here, they can speak, but they are nonsensible usually in those cases. So the corresponding areas on the right side are involved in nonverbal language components too. Again, you've already seen this, but just kind of showing you that cerebral cortex and the function there. Also, the dura septa and the durovenous sinuses, make sure that you know each of these and memorize those. The meninges, understanding the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, the pia mater, which are just, the meninges are just the surroundings of the brain and brain tissue to protect it, and understanding the structure of those is important. Also, the cerebral spinal fluid forms a liquid cushion of sort of constant volume around the brain. And so it gives buoyancy to CNS structures. It reduces the weight of the brain by 97% by floating, so you're not crushed under its own weight. It protects the CNS from blows and other trauma, and it nourishes the brain and carries chemical signals. So it's composed of this water solution of blood plasma, and is also sterile. So if there is a bacteria or virus or anything in the cerebrospinal fluid, that's a sign that someone is very, very sick. The choroid plexus, that's a cluster of these capillaries that hangs from the roof of each ventricle, enclosed by the pia mater and surrounding layer of the ependymal cells. The CFS is filtered from the plexus at a constant rate. And then sort of like the cilia of these ependymal cells basically help keep the CSF in motion, or the cerebral spinal fluid in motion. Normal adult cerebral spinal fluid is about 150 milliliters, is replaced about every 8 hours. Well, that's pretty good replacement rate, by the way. The blood-brain barrier helps maintain the stable environment for the brain. So chemical variations could lead to uncomfortable neuron firings. So substances from the blood must pass through this continuous endothelium of capillary walls before they actually gain entry into those neurons. So there's tight junctions that ensure substances that pass through. There's a feat of astrocytes and smooth muscle like endothelius around endothelial cells that help promote tight junction formation. And then the substances move through these epithelial cells via simple diffusion and specific transportation mechanisms such as transcytosis, which moves larger substances into and out of the brain. And so you can kind of see here is the blood-brain barrier. You can see the interstitial fluid on the outside. You see neurons. You see astrocytes also coming around surrounding those brain capillaries. This is normal capillaries. This is brain capillaries. But basically, there's tight junctions between each of these. They are key structure of the blood-brain barrier. They exclude molecules except those that are lipid-soluble from the brain tissue. And so it's very, very important there. There's a thick basement membrane surrounding the capillaries, is the last part of this barrier substance that must pass through. It contains enzymes that destroy certain chemicals that would activate brain neurons when they shouldn't be. But it is absent in some areas, such as the vomiting center and the hypothalamus, because those are necessary to monitor chemical composition and temperature of the blood. So that area it can get through, whereas others it can't. The gross anatomy and projection, of course, the spinal cord is enclosed in the vertebral column. It begins at the foramen magnum and ends at L1 or L2 vertebra. The functions, it provides two-way communications to and from the brain and body. The major reflex center, really, reflexes are initiated and completed at the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is very important for a lot of reasons. And this, of course, is just a gross structure of the spinal cord, making sure that you understand each of those components. This is a diagram of a lumbar puncture. And so basically you see this region, basically the L5 is right here. And so the lumbar puncture needle entering that that space to basically get a sample of cerebral spinal fluid, or also to things like medication that needs to dampen the I can't think of the word I want to use to get rid of pain and stuff like that. So if needed, and then things like childbirth or something like that, if you're going to limit the pain that you're going to have in childbirth. These are the spinal cord segments, making sure that you understand each of those segments. You see where the spinal nerves for each one are. The lower regions of the spinal segments are not adjacent to their corresponding vertebrae, so that's something that you do have to be aware of when you're trying to understand those. And of course, this is the anatomy of the spinal cord, making sure that you understand each component of that. Again, you do have some things that, you have the spinal dura mater, the arachnoid mater, all of those things, as well as each anatomy of each one. So making sure that you go through and understand each of these aspects is important. Memorizing and understanding not only the physiology, but memorizing those anatomy portions as well. So that's a little bit of chapter 12. There is a little bit more to it. Make sure you go through and utilize your resources and any resources I've provided for you. Otherwise, if you need me, I'm here to help. Make sure to ask any questions because I'm always happy to help. And I'll see you in the next chapter. Hope you have a great day.